After a 3-month gap, we return this morning to our series in the 10 words. We've reached the 9th of them. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbour. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbour. In our translation, it's the same whether you look at Exodus chapter 20, verse 16, or Deuteronomy 5, verse 20, where the commandments are repeated. In the Hebrew, there are actually 2 different words that are used. There's probably not a great deal of difference between them. If there is a distinction, in Exodus, it's a lying witness. In Deuteronomy, it's an empty witness, a worthless witness. Well, as usual, we'll start by asking, what does this commandment tell us about God? Why does he give this instruction to us? And there are at least 2 things that it tells us about God. And the first is, he is a God of truth. He's a God of truth. He hates lying. In Proverbs 6, for instance, we read, "These 6 things the Lord hates, yes, 7 are an abomination to him. A proud look, a lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that devises wicked plans, feet that are swift in running to evil, a false witness who speaks lies, and one who sows discord among brethren." Douglas Wilson comments, God hates 7 things, and lying makes the list twice, maybe even 3 times. It's usually what is said that causes discord. There's a very sober example in Acts 5 of how seriously God takes lying. You know the story. Ananias and Sapphira sold a possession, and they gave part of the proceeds to the church. There's nothing wrong with that. It was their property. They could do with it what they wanted. But they pretended that they had given all the money from the sale to the church. And for that lie, they both died. God himself never lies. As Samuel told Saul, the strength of Israel will not lie. John 17, but Jesus prays, "Sanctify them by your truth. Your word is truth." God's word can always be trusted. God is a God of truth. It's the devil who's the father of lies. So that's the first thing it tells us. God is a God of truth. And secondly, he's a God of justice. God of justice. The context of this commandment is the law court. A man's called to testify in court in a case against one of his neighbours. He must tell the truth so that justice is done. I remember in those days there was no DNA evidence. There was no matching of fingerprints. Almost everything depended on the testimony of the witnesses. Depending on the seriousness of the crime, a man's life could depend on what they said. And God is not indifferent to injustice. So we have this commandment not to be a lying witness, one who says things that he knows are not true, not to be an empty witness, one who says things he doesn't know to be true. In fact, God takes further steps to protect justice. First of all, there had to be more than one witness. Deuteronomy 17 tells us, "Whoever is deserving of death shall be put to death on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. He shall not be put to death on the testimony of 1 witness." There has to be corroboration of the story. Make it harder for someone to get his neighbour into trouble, serious trouble, even execution, by telling lies about him. The next verse gives another requirement. The hands of the witnesses shall be the first against him to put him to death, and afterwards the hands of all the people. That was a case of death usually by stoning, so the witnesses had to be the ones who cast the first stone at him. In other words, you can't tell lies and then run away. You have to play the most prominent role in the execution. You have to face the consequences of your lives. Deuteronomy 19 repeats that requirement. By the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, the matter shall be established. Then it says that the judges must make careful inquiry about what has been said. And if they find out that the witness has been a false witness, one who's testified falsely against his brother, then you shall do to him as he thought to have done to his brother. So you shall put away the evil from among you, and those who remain shall hear and fear, and hereafter they shall not again commit such evil among you. Your eye shall not pity, life shall be for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. A false witness must face the punishment that he accused someone else, the punishment for the crime of which he accused another. It's a deterrent to others. If you're telling lies and it's found out, you're going to suffer the punishment. You shall do no injustice in judgment, says Leviticus. You shall not be partial to the poor, nor honour the person of the mighty. In righteousness you shall judge your neighbour. No favouritism. Not to show pity to someone because he's poor, seems to be helpless. And neither are you to favour the rich man who's eloquent, who can speak well, who can put on an impressive show. There'll be no automatic assumption that one party is right. No #believe women, for example. You shall not circulate a false report, Exodus 23. Do not put your hand with the wicked to be an unrighteous witness. You shall not follow a crowd to do evil. Nor shall you testify in a dispute so as to turn aside after many to pervert justice. Even if the majority want to do what is wrong, justice must not be perverted. You mustn't give way to the demands of the Twitter mob. God is a God of truth, a God of justice. That's what this commandment is telling us. He shall judge the world in righteousness. He shall administer judgment for the peoples in uprightness. Are you ready to face that righteous judgment? We look up. We see what this word tells us about the character of our God, a God of truth and justice. I'm going to change my usual order here and look ahead to Christ. How do we see this commandment fulfilled in him? Listen first to his words as he confronts the Jews in John chapter 8. He doesn't mince his words. You are of your father the devil. The desires of your father you want to do. He was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in the truth because there is no truth in him. When he speaks a lie, he speaks from his own resources, for he is a liar and the father of it. But because I tell the truth, you do not believe me. Which of you convicts me of sin? And if I tell the truth, why do you not believe me? He who is of God hears God's words. Therefore you do not hear, because you are not of God. I tell the truth, Jesus says. Nobody can contradict him. Later in John he says he is truth itself. I am the way, the truth, and the life. Peter gives this testimony in 1 Peter 2. I'm reading from the ESV. Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example so that you might follow in his steps. He committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. He was a man of truth, no deceit in his mouth. Entrusting himself to the one who judges justly. Here's an example of Jesus' attitude to injustice at the beginning of John chapter 8. The scribes and Pharisees brought to him a woman who had been caught in adultery. What's wrong with that scenario? The Jewish leaders said this woman had been caught in the very act. You can't commit adultery on your own. Where was the partner? Where was the man? According to the law, he should also be executed. Why wasn't he there? Why did they let him go? Sexual bias, singling out the woman as the obvious guilty party? Or was he too important for them to get him into trouble? We don't know. But it's obvious this is not a genuine concern for morality here. These men want to test Jesus. Why? Because the Roman authorities didn't allow the Jews to carry out capital punishment. So if Jesus insists on carrying out the penalty of the law, the scribes and Pharisees can go to the Roman authorities and accuse him of rebelling against Rome. But if he tries to excuse her, then they'll say, well, you're disregarding God's law. How does Jesus respond to this test? First of all, he says nothing. He writes something in the sand. When they keep asking him, he straightens up and says, he who is without sin, let him cast the first stone. And then he goes back to his writing in the sand. Was he just doodling? Or was he writing something that they could read? Something that pricked their consciences? We don't know. But one by one they left, till only Jesus and the woman were left. And now, of course, there were no witnesses to condemn her. And Jesus does not condemn. But he challenges her to leave her life of sin. Go, he says, sin no more. R.C. Sproul comments that when Jesus said, he was without sin among you, let him throw a stone at her first. He was not destroying the whole judicial system of the law of God. He was speaking to people who were hypocritically bloodthirsty in their desire to shame and punish a person who had fallen. In other words, they had no concept of the grace of God. It is not wrong to punish criminals for their crimes, but it is wrong to convene a kangaroo court, drag a person before such a court, and add insult to her injury. So I believe Jesus was dealing with the manifest hypocrisy of these who are judging this woman. Notice that Jesus did not hedge between the Jewish law and the Roman law. He sided with Moses. He gave his verdict. The woman was guilty and should be stoned. But he then examined the executioners and found them lacking. Only he met the qualification that he himself had given for carrying out the execution. You see, in Christ, this concern for truth and for justice. And then we look in at our own hearts. Most of us won't have to give testimony in court, but the principles of truth and justice have a far wider application. As is so often the case, the Heidelberg Catechism helps us to examine ourselves. It asks, what is required in the Ninth Commandment? Answer, I must not give false testimony against anyone, twist no one's words, not gossip or slander, not condemn or join in condemning anyone rashly and unheard. Rather, I must avoid all lying and deceit as the devil's own works, under penalty of God's heavy wrath. In court and everywhere else I must love the truth, speak and confess it honestly, and do what I can to defend and promote my neighbour's honour and reputation. Let's go through that statement again, phrase by phrase. I must not give false testimony against anyone. Have you ever told lies about someone to get them into trouble, or to get yourself out of trouble? Whistler me. She made me do it. twist no one's words. Only too easy to do that, isn't it? Ever lift a soundbite out of a speech to give completely the wrong impression of what was said? Ever told someone about the mean things somebody said about you or to you without giving the context of what you had just said to them? Not gossip or slander. Gossip is talking about people in a way that damages their reputation, whether it's true or false. Slander, deliberate falsehood. Are you always careful to verify what you hear before you pass it on? Slander also includes assuming the worst possible motives for other people's intentions, not giving them the benefit of the doubt. Have you ever assumed that you know why somebody's done what they have? They couldn't possibly have failed to see that. Perhaps you try to greet somebody after church, but she puts her nose in the air and brushes off without a word. You say, how rude, you tell your friends. Actually, she didn't hear you. She's got a runny nose and her tissues are in the car, so she's off to try and get to them. You assume you know what's happening. And it says, nor condemn or join in condemning anyone rashly and unheard. I already mentioned the Twitter mob. These days of social media, it's all too easy for some to be accused and condemned without any opportunity to put their own side of the case. A serious allegation is made. People demand you must take a side in this. If you don't participate, you're accused of not believing the victims or not caring about justice. We're seeing that at the moment, aren't we? Think of all the allegations in Prince Harry's book. Even those of us who have not the slightest intention of ever looking inside it have been bombarded with stories, allegations against umpteen different people. We don't know the facts, nor do most of the people who are repeating what they have heard without it being checked, without it being verified and proven. Rather, well, when we hear something bad about someone we dislike, we're all too ready to believe it without checking, aren't we? Recently heard a story about a certain minister. Don't have the highest opinion of him. Well, I don't know the facts, but my immediate reaction is, that could well be true. It seems to fit. But if I'd heard the same thing about a minister I knew and respected, I'd got a very different reaction to the same story from the same people. Are you sure that's really what happened? Don't condemn or join in condemning anyone rashly and unheard. Rather, I must avoid all lying and deceit as the devil's own works, under penalty of God's heavy wrath. All lying and deceit. We may avoid blatant lies. What about exaggeration? Can you be trusted to represent yourself accurately, even in the smallest details of your life? What about careless promises you don't really intend to keep? I'll pray for you. Give me a call if you need anything. In court and everywhere else, I must love the truth, speak and confess it honestly. Not just to speak the truth. Do we actually love it? And do we speak and confess it honestly? Douglas Wilson says, reject truth which is just technically the truth. This is just clever lying. Children, how many times have you told your parents just half the story when the other half made all the difference? Many pietistic Christians comfort themselves that this is scrupulous truth-telling, when it really just reveals the subtlety of their hearts. do what I can to defend and promote my neighbour's honour and reputation. Most of us could recover more quickly if we lost our homes, our cars, our bank accounts, than if we lost our good name. As Proverbs says, a good name is to be chosen rather than great riches, loving favour rather than silver and gold. The testimony you bear about your neighbours in everyday moments will shape your life and theirs, for good or ill. Sometimes the problem isn't what we say, it's what we don't say. We don't challenge the gossip. We don't defend the person whose name is being unfairly dragged through the mud. Well, we've let the Catechism expose our hearts. What is there left to say about how we are to keep the commandment as we look down to the path in front of our feet? Well, first, we need to be aware of the culture that we live in. Peter Leithart comments, the ninth word is a fitting word for our mediated age. We're spun by a whirlpool of rumour, innuendo, false accusation, slander, libel. People are tried and condemned by online lynch mobs. We like or share tweets and Facebook posts, even though we can't possibly confirm their accuracy. We exaggerate the stupidity or malevolence of ideological adversaries to score points and win honour in Twitter combat. Officially committed to the 10 words, the Church does no better. Christians fire up the digital kindling to burn supposed heretics without due process, humility, or care. That's a description of our society, isn't it? Pay attention to what Leithart goes on to say. He says this isn't merely an improper use of neutral technology. YouTube gives preference to controversial videos. The more outlandish, the better. Twitter is a medium of self-presentation, often self-preening, where every user plays a game of brand management. Not by accident, but by design, social media encourages violations of the ninth word. Not by accident, but by design, social media encourages violations of the ninth word. We need to be aware of what's going on so that we aren't caught in the traps that social media presents. I'm not saying we have to abandon these things. If they are used carefully, they can be helpful. But thoughtless swallowing of what we see and hear and read online will lead us astray. We need to be aware of the kind of culture we live in. And then secondly, we must be committed to truth and integrity. Truth and integrity. In a sense, truth is what we are before it's what we say. George Orwell said, in a time of universal deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act. Following Augustine, Martin Luther distinguished 3 classes of lies: the humorous, the helpful, and the harmful. Now, the humorous isn't a problem. If I tell you a joke, it's probably made up. Never happened. 2 men walk into a bar. Ouch. There was an Englishman, an Irishman, and a Scotsman, and so on. As long as it's clear that it's a joke, it's fine. The Proverbs 76 does warn us, like a madman who throws firebrands, arrows, and death is the man who deceives his neighbour and says, I was only joking. And fiction is similar, though it's not necessarily funny. You may say that's true of my jokes as well. When you pick up a novel, you know it isn't telling the truth. It isn't what's really happened. Even a historical novel, you don't rely on it as an accurate retelling. Yes, it may give you an idea of what was happening at the time, but parts of it, you know, come out of the author's imagination. Again, there may be an issue with some books. If you read a fictionalised biography, for example, how do you know which parts are true, which are made up? I remember Gilbert complaining about A Children's Life of Spurgeon. Now, if I remember rightly, the book began with Queen Victoria going incognito to hear Spurgeon's last sermon. Well, apart from the fact that nobody knew it was going to be Spurgeon's last sermon, did it really happen? Did she go and hear him? We don't know. It could have happened. We have no evidence. But because it's supposed to be a biography, the young reader might well come away with the impression this is historical fact. And there's the harmful lie. It's the one we think of most. Once obviously in focus here, the lying witness, the use of falsehood to deceive or misrepresent. We've said quite a bit about that already. How do you speak to or of other people? Do you tear them down by unfair criticism and condemnation? Ephesians 4 tells us that we should be speaking the truth in love, may grow up in all things into him who is the head, Christ, from whom the whole body, joined and knit together by what every joint supplies, according to the effective working by which every part does its share, causes growth of the body for the edifying of itself in love. Note that in such as speaking the truth in love. Philip Ryken comments that some Christians are more than willing to tell it like it is. There's something brutal about their honesty. Just understand that keeping the Ninth Commandment does not mean saying whatever comes to mind. In many situations in life, when it is better to say nothing at all. What the Ninth Commandment means is saying the honest thing when it's our duty to say it in a loving way. Another way we can lose our integrity is by flattering people, puffing someone up with insincere, exaggerated commendation, manipulation, master's praise, to try and enhance trust or get their favour. And just taking credit for someone else's work. Never been easier now, has it? With thanks to the internet and the copy-paste feature. Intellectual property rights recognise the human tendency to break the ninth word. That has always been with us, even when plagiarism wasn't so easy. Just so we can exalt our own plans by attaching God's name to them. So can exalt our own efforts by concealing the names of the others who've laboured alongside us or before us. It can be a difficult one for the preacher, can't it? My material comes from many different sources, and often I quote them. It would break the flow of the sermon if I labelled every phrase I've borrowed. Often more names of authors in my notes than I mention. And as someone once said, I may have milked 100 cows, but I made my own butter. Just as we're tempted to take credit for what other people have done or said, we're tempted to shift blame for what we have done. We need to be ready to admit our sin, to confess without qualifications. We need to take responsibility for what we hear and what we believe. Men lie because there's a market for it. Are you part of that market? A ready audience of someone who makes up stories? Thomas Watson said, "He that raises a slander carries the devil in his tongue. He that receives it carries the devil in his ear." There's almost nothing more important than living our lives as faithful witnesses. Our words need to be trustworthy all the time. Otherwise, why would people believe us if we try to give them the words of life, the gospel? Why should they trust us to speak of eternal things? We can't be trusted to speak of temporal things. One more issue I want to raise. Are we always to tell the truth? Paul tells the Ephesians, putting away lying, let each one of you speak truth with his neighbour, for we are members of one another. But are there no exceptions to that? This is where we come to the so-called helpful lie. The times when it seems that a half-truth or a small lie will smooth the way without doing any harm. Someone's looking for reassurance. Seems impolite and even damaging to be completely honest. Or someone asks, how are you? And find, well, they've not got the time or the interest to listen to a full account of what's going on in your life. In those circumstances, it's probably best to try and say as little as possible, deflect a question rather than answering it. But there are extreme situations where that's not possible. Classic example, of course, is the Dutch in the Second World War hiding the Jews from the Nazis. Well, suppose you've got Jews in your house and the Gestapo come to you and say, have you got Jews in your basement? Well, you can't just say, not say it. You can't just keep quiet. That's telling them blatantly, I've got something to hide. You can guarantee your house is going to be thoroughly searched. And if you tell the plain truth, yes, I've got Jews in the basement, you're condemning both them and yourself. So what else can you do? If you think the Jews are well concealed, you might fling open the door and say, see for yourself, I've got nothing to hide. You can tell the truth in order to deceive. Of course I'm hiding Jews, ha ha ha. But how's that different from a lie? From saying straight out, no, there are no Jews in my house. Is that lie justified? Now, you will no doubt be aware there are widely varying views on that question. Personally, I would say yes, I think it is. And that's why I read the passage about the Hebrew midwives from Exodus 1. Was what the midwives told the Pharaoh true? Probably not. But God blessed them for it. Notice verse 20, therefore God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very mighty. And so it was because the midwives feared God that he provided households for them. It's not an isolated example. You have Rahab in chapter 2 of Joshua, hiding the spies, sending the king's soldiers in the wrong direction. Similar story in 2 Samuel 17, when David had to flee from Absalom, and there are people trying to get messages to him. You have Jael in Judges 4. She pretends to offer Sisera a safe tent when she plans to split his skull with a tent peg. David repeatedly misleads to escape from Saul and Achish and others. As Peter Leithart says, these righteous deceptions all take place in wartime and typically protect innocent life. On a par with the use of camouflage, other forms of deception, it's legitimate to deceive an enemy during wartime. That's not bearing false witness against your neighbour. Reminds me of a story which I haven't been able to verify. I don't know whether it's true or not, but so I'm not trying to say this is definitely what happened, but the story was in the Second World War that the Germans, in order to deceive the Allies, built whole airfields with lots of wooden planes and so on. Then the RAF came and dropped a wooden bomb on it. There, as I say, I tried to investigate whether that was actually a true story or not. Nobody seemed to be sure. It could have happened, maybe not, but you get the idea either way. It's an attempt to deceive the enemy, perfectly legitimate in wartime. But as Leithart says, these are exceptions. Truthful speech is an act of love, and we are to love enemies as well as friends. In all normal circumstances, we speak truth to and about our enemies, refusing to minimize their virtues or exaggerate their faults. In normal circumstances, we speak truth to and about even our enemies. We don't minimize their virtues to make them seem worse than they are, exaggerate their faults. We must speak truth to them and about them. That's the normal, the default position. Any exception is very much an exception, a rare situation where You're not bearing false witness against your neighbour, but in order to save your neighbour from great danger. And finally, we look forward. And here I'm simply going to quote Jen Wilkin. In the new heavens and the new earth, there will be an end to the bearing of false witness against our neighbour, made in God's image. Imagine that for a minute. If you ever felt the sting of being maligned, or the shame of having maligned someone, imagine a place where that never ever happens. If you ever felt the justness of being rightly represented, or the satisfaction of having edified another with your speech, imagine a place where that always and everywhere is the case. Every time we refuse to revile, flatter, go mute or misappropriate, we live in that future reality today. Every time we choose to speak truthful words, encouraging words, life-giving words about and to our neighbour, we invite heaven down to earth. May God help us to do that.